For the purposes of today's Solutions Watch, I'm going to turn to a different source, but one that hopefully will be familiar, again, to Corbett Report members and people in the Corbett Report community generally. Specifically, I'm talking about Gavin Mounsey, who, in addition to being a Corbett Report member who is frequently in the comment section of Corbett Report under the username G, hopefully you have seen and read his posts on that, but hopefully you've also followed that back to the source of that information. For example, he writes at Substack at gavinmounsey.substack.com, and he's a prolific writer there, posting many, many things on a frequent basis. So I hope you're following his work there. Also, you may or may not know, he has a book, which I have a copy of here. He was kind enough to send into the P.O. box for Pilato, who sent it on to me. It's called Recipes for Reciprocity, and it is at recipesforreciprocity.com, where you can find out about this, the regenerative way from seed to table, which talks about the regenerative practices, permaculture, stacking functions, very specific and practical information, and then, as you would expect, a lot of recipes of very specific things that can be grown and made in the kitchen from the things that you were growing in the garden. So, again, very specific and practical tips for people who are serious about actually weaning themselves off of this industrial food supply, processed chemical gunk system that we are stuck on. And as I said at the beginning, as I will continue to stress, as I always stress, it is not a binary off-on 100% 0% switch. It's not that if you are not suddenly completely free of the supermarket and all processed food whatsoever tomorrow, then it's a failure and who cares? It's a process of weaning and of replacement and finding what works and gradually finding your ways towards regenerative and sustainable practices that can help foster that community which will see us through to the other side of this problem of the future of food. Having said all of that, I just recorded a very interesting conversation with Gavin Mounsey about his work, why and how he does it, what he is specifically growing, and what processes and practices he uses that help him to shape his garden into something that's productive and regenerative. So, enjoy the conversation.
So, it was the flavor of the homegrown tomatoes that got me into gardening back when I was like 19. And I've been doing it ever since. And then the book was kind of over a decade of cooking and having fun in the kitchen and recording my recipes. And then I took a permaculture course, and I thought, what a great way to combine my passion in the kitchen with something that can help other people, to show them how to grow the food as well as prepare it in the kitchen.
You know, that makes sense, because it's holistic in every way, because we are taught to compartmentalize all of this, that there are people who produce and grow the food, and then there are people who distribute the food, and then there are people who sell the food, and then there are people who prepare the food, and they're all separate and disconnected, and you chop it all up into bits. Whereas, imagine if you could grow and prepare the food yourself. What a difference that would make. So I think that starts to touch on what I really want to get into today, which is the concept of regenerative agriculture, which, as you sort of allude to there, is to be contrasted with the traditional industrial farming methods that have become the standard. All of these heavy chemical inputs and machinery that is used in most standard farming practices today. Everyone has a different definition of regenerative agriculture. So I wanted to go from your book. When you write about Regeneration 101, you write, natural living systems are regenerative. They renew themselves. The materials and energy that drive living systems are cycled through that system again and again. And you say creating and supporting regenerative systems means moving beyond sustainability and actually giving back to the ecosystem around us as we take care of our own needs. I wonder if you could expand on that. How do you think of and how do you frame this concept of regenerative agriculture?
Well, it's like organic is avoiding the synthetics, avoiding the poisons, the pesticides, and it takes a step beyond that when you go to regenerative, because you're not just trying to sustain the land being able to produce what you want without poisoning yourself. You're actively increasing the fertility of the land and hopefully the biodiversity within and around the farm. So you're focusing on, first and foremost, the soil life. You're giving back to the soil life through composting, through mulching. And by doing that, it's a benefit to you as well as your community around you of non-human beings, of all the pollinators and the winged ones and everything. So it's basically to tap into the already existing abundance that's in a forest ecosystem, like you touched on in How to Eat a Pine Tree with it was Michael Hoffman and Jim Gale, where they talked about how if you look at a forest, it just grows by itself. It fertilizes itself. It's watered itself by the rain. And so regenerative agriculture looks to that mentality of the forest ecosystem and the self-regenerating nature of ecosystems, and then applies it in how we grow our food. And it can be on a large scale. It can be like on a rancher scale where you have cows moving around, emulating the movement of like buffalo. They're eating up the grass. They're depositing the dung. They're pulling on the roots, and they're stimulating deeper root growth in the rhizosphere. There's more biological activity, and that's retaining more water. So you can do it on a large scale, or you can do it, as I focused on in my book, in a really decentralized and localized scale, whether it's just a balcony or your backyard. You can start to cycle your kitchen waste and your leaves and different things that are just thrown out by most people, and build really fertile soil. And then you get some amazing food in the process.
You know, what you talk about there raises, I think, one of the important aspects of all of this, which is that fundamentally this is almost a mindset type of thing. Because I imagine a lot of the reason that people have their reservations about this is that we are, generally speaking, in a mindset of it is us versus nature. And we are trying to tame nature, essentially, to do our bidding. And how do you do that? Well, you do this monocropping, and you have to use all these pesticides and chemical inputs, and you have to basically fight against the earth in order to get it to produce abundance. Whereas, well, obviously the earth is abundant, and it does function even without any human input. So you mentioned how important and fundamental the soil itself is to this process. And again, I think the mindset that most people have is that when you plant some crop, you are taking the nutrients out of the soil. And the way to essentially regenerate the soil would be to leave it fallow for a year or to rotate crops. But obviously there are crops that can actually fix nutrients back into the soil and can regenerate the soil itself. Talk about cover crops and specifics of the types of things that people can do to actually start building a healthy soil.
For sure, yeah. There's when you look in, the forest, you've got communities of plants. Some of them are creating huge amounts of biomass that's going down onto the soil. It's decomposing, it's retaining moisture, it's adding SOM or soil organic matter, and it's building the ability of the soil to hold nutrients and water. Some of the plants that exist in the forest are nitrogen fixing. So when you emulate that in the garden, you're looking at leguminous plants. You're looking at things like lupins, of course, beans and other legumes. And so you plant those intermittent throughout in a forest garden, throughout perennial crops. And they're literally, like you say, they're pulling in the abundance that's in the atmosphere of the nitrogen, which is that thing that all the governments are freaking out about and trying to restrict people in the synthetic sense, which is it's all around us. And they're fixing it onto the root nodules, and then the neighboring plants are getting access to that fertilizer. So that's one of the things that's an ancient companion planting system called Three Sisters. So the First Nation people on Turtle Island, now known as North America, they would grow corn, bean, and squash together. And they would grow the corn as the tall member that would support the beans. And then they would grow the squash at the base to choke out the weeds. And the beans, in that case, were the nitrogen-fixing member of that companion planting system. So they were literally fertilizing their companions, and they were all working together towards a synergistic abundance that they alone couldn't accomplish. So in the context of the garden, I like to, when I do a raised bed, I'll sow out some clover seeds. I'll also plant things, like I said, like lupins adjacent to my blueberry plants, let's say, or my apple trees. And so they're bringing in the pollinators simultaneously, and they're feeding into the plant roots. And so instead of having to add that synthetic NPK like Miracle-Gro, I'm getting it right from the atmosphere. I'm pulling it in from all around me.
It's almost like the earth is naturally abundant, and you just have to find the ways that it works together naturally. So let's talk about your situation in particular, because of course this is the type of thing that is going to look different in every different climate and every different environment. So let's talk specifically. I understand you're in Southern Ontario. Tell us about the garden that you have going right now.
So what we had originally was when I first got here, I was just starting to learn about permaculture. So I had straight rows, and I was just starting to learn about companion planting. But as I understood more about soil ecology, and I learned about things like hugelkultur, which is emulating forest decomposition to build soil matter by putting rotting wood down under the ground. What I did was is I excavated the sod, because grass is totally useless, symbol status from eons past that people spend huge amounts of money growing, and I thought, what a ridiculous waste of space. And I carved that out. I dug down about a 1-inch trench down underneath the sod. I put in some decomposing wood from the forest around me down there. Then I flipped the sod upside down so it could become food for the soil organisms on top of the wood. And then I put things like compost and some leaves and grass clippings. And then as I built my raised beds up about 1.5 feet, 2 feet with some cinder blocks and natural wood, I put the topsoil on top of that. So I created like a long-term soil nutrient cycling system. So the earthworms are going to be down there. They're going to be moving all the nutrients from the rotting wood up to the roots of my plants in the topsoil. And when the perennial crops reach the roots down, they're going to tap into like a sponge of water. So in the drought, the apple trees and the blueberries and all those guys in there, they're going to be able to get water when I can't or don't want to have to water. Because the idea is to let nature do the work for you when you're doing permaculture, when you're doing regenerative agriculture. So yeah, we created these raised beds, and they've got basically the water reservoir through the decomposing wood, and then I top dress them with compost that we make from like yard clippings, kitchen clippings, and stuff like that. And that's all it takes. And they basically operate on the rain cycle.
Hello James and fellow Corbetteers. Since we spoke in last June, I've had many people write me who share that they're Corbett Report members who got a copy of my book and were sharing their experiences of growing the seeds and their plans for the future. Thanks Brian from No Mask channel in Japan. Thank you Abby from England. Thank you General Bottle Washer, and thank you Steve Connolly for the message you sent me. It means the world. Since then I've been working on writing articles for my next book, Studying the Forest as a way to connect with the natural abundance in nature. So let me take you on a little field trip to the forest where I've been doing some field research. This is an old growth shagbark hickory. We're here in southern Ontario, and this is one of the amazing trees you can grow in food forest designs that could grow well underneath super canopy trees like white pine, tulip trees, and a long time ago the American chestnut. This tree can live for hundreds of years, and this one's already well over 100. It can produce nuts for 200 years plus. They resemble pecans, and you can also grow other trees in the proximity like pawpaws, and then understory herbs and shrubs like wild leeks and ginseng. So this can be part of a long-term, multi-storied food production system we can give to future generations. Here I have a slideshow offering a range of different pictures of shagbark hickory growing in their natural climate, from summer production into the fall dormancy. Towards the end of this slideshow, you can see some very old-growth hickory trees that are well over 100 years old. Here I offer a few pictures that show both hickory seeds that are encased in their shell casings, as well as hickory seeds that have removed the shell casings, and then hickory nuts that have had the shell removed, ready to eat. For some excellent information on this particular species of tree, I highly suggest checking out Akiva Silver's book called Trees of Power, 10 Essential Arboreal Allies. Now you can see a number of the pages here from his book that pertain to this species in particular, and some nuts that he sent me which had excellent germination rates, so you can tell he knows what he's talking about. At the end of the slideshow you can see I have a shagbark hickory seedling in an air pruning bed. Now these are ideal for starting shagbark hickory and other taprooted seedlings such as oak and pawpaw, because what happens is when the taproot reaches the bottom of the bed, it senses the air, it stops growing the taproot, and it grows fibrous roots around the main taproot. This allows the plant to be tucked in for the winter or put into pots and have an intact taproot for planting out the next season. If you look for these trees up in the northern areas of the Norfolk County of Ontario and by Lake Huron, you'll find unnaturally high concentrations of these trees alongside many other food and medicine plants that were planted by indigenous peoples hundreds of years ago. So this tree was used in regenerative agroforestry as part of Ontario's ancient history. This is something we can learn from for producing food in the future, using low maintenance no pesticides, no tilling food species. You can learn more about shagbark hickory if you check out my article on Substack. If you want to learn more about shagbark hickory, how you can cultivate it in the regenerative garden or in the food forest, you can check the description section under the video and you'll find an in-depth article on this species. Here we are in one of the very last intact old-growth Carolinian forests in southern Ontario. Now why that's significant is as someone who's studying regenerative agroforestry or food forest design, I can come here and see nature's original design structure for how these trees grow together with each other. And when I find trees like this tulip tree here, which provides medicine for people, as well as nectar for bees, and I find the shagbark hickory, and I find the black walnut, and I find the beech, and many others, I can see how they integrate themselves with different trees, emulate that in my food forest designs, and then build on that, adding other stacked functions like growing mushrooms underneath. This here is a shagbark hickory tree. These are a very long-lived tree. They can live over 300 years, producing nutrient-dense and delicious nuts that resemble pecans for over 200 years of their lifespan. These trees don't require pesticides, herbicides, tilling the ground, irrigation. They produce a copious amounts of food with very little effort. If you look for these trees up in the northern areas of the Norfolk County of Ontario and by Lake Huron, you'll find unnaturally high concentrations of these trees alongside many other food and medicine plants that were planted by Indigenous peoples hundreds of years ago. So this tree was used in regenerative agroforestry as part of Ontario's ancient history. This is something we can learn from for producing food in the future. This is an eastern white pine. Now this is a middle-aged tree, probably about 80 feet tall and maybe just over 100 years old. These trees, when they're allowed to reach their mature state, can actually reach almost 3 times that height, 240 feet. About in the year 1840, the records show that when the original trees were logged from the shores of Lake Erie, they were getting multiple trees that were 8 feet in diameter and 220 to 240 feet. Now, because of something called generational amnesia or shifting baseline syndrome, people that are born today in southern Ontario see big white pines like this and they think this is an old growth tree. Now, in reality, the majority of the climax trees were clear-cut in the name of colonization and providing ship masts to the British Navy in the 1800s. But there are still a few old growth groves left if you go up to Algonquin. They weren't quite as big as the ones on the shore of Lake Erie, but you can still get an idea. Now these trees were the super canopy trees in this Carolinian forest, providing nesting habitat for eagles, hawks, and providing medicine for humans. You can use the needles to make a nutrient-dense tea with vitamin C and shikimic acid for helping your immune system, and there's a number of other things that this tree can be used for without harming the tree, such as basket weaving and many other things. If you want to learn more about eastern white pines in the context of regenerative agroforestry or food forest design, check out the link in the description section to find an in-depth article that covers the species. Here we are in one of the last little pockets of old growth forest left in southern Ontario, and this here is a kingnut, otherwise known as a shellbark hickory. They're quite uncommon here in the south of Ontario because they were targeted for logging earlier on in the settlement phase, but they're actually a tree that was known by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and those members of it, like the Wendat and the Huron, as the anti-famine tree. So where this tree was planted and tended in great numbers as part of their food forest designs, no human ever starved. These trees produce a copious amount of nutrient-dense nuts that offer healthy fats, minerals, vitamins, and medicinal compounds that prevent neurodegenerative diseases and cancer. So when the French settlers came, the Jesuit priests and the military officers, they found there was very little of those diseases that were plaguing their European populations back home, and they were surprised when they shared what one of their main food sources was that they had stashed and collected in their baskets over the winter. It was the kingnut. So this is one of these trees that we can team up with to build food resilience for our communities. These trees can live well over 200 years, being productive for over a century and producing copious amounts of food with very little inputs, no synthetic fertilizer, no irrigation required, just abundance. And it's a mother tree, so it brings in biodiversity and supporting the other non-human beings that are part of our communities too. Now I go around in the winter looking for these trees. I look for the signs, which is these beautiful big nut casings that are a lot bigger than their shagbark cousins. And that's an indicator that this one had a mast year recently, dropping copious amounts of food on the forest floor. And that means I can come back in the future, I can collect the seeds for propagating, maybe do some foraging, and make sure that these trees go on into the future to feed the 7th generation that comes after us. In Diana Bursford Kroger's new book called Our Green Heart, she talks about this tree, otherwise known as the king nut or the shellbark, and how it can provide food resilience for our future and help to bring stabilization to the soil and our ecosystems. In her chapter called The Magic of the King Nut, she says, I have a scientific interest in the walnut. In particular, hickories. This genus, Caria, consists of a small pool of 20 to 25 species worldwide. The walnut has had an intense relationship with the terroir of the Americas for a long, long time. The solar exposure on the 2 continents is very strong. The evidence of this photonic abundance is seen in the crop of nuts these trees produce every year. Every aspect of the walnut's comfortable ride in the sun is unique to these trees. I look for king nut regularly in my travels. It is an easy tree to spot, even at a great distance, because the bark curls. The mature king nut is a feast for the eyes. Long plates of its bark become repelled by its cambium and curl into 6-foot lengths. It is said that where these trees grow as mature mother trees, they are among some of the last left in Canada. Diana, one bright morning, received a small box that had been sent by express by one of the rangers from the Windsor area. She opened it and to her delight found 5 king nuts beaming up at her from the protection of their light brown winter overcoats. Let me describe these magnificent anti-famine nut trees. They like to have bur oak as companions for life. The king nut can grow in a wide range of soils, from dry and sandy to river bottom. A nearby spring or standing pool of water will not deter them. The tree is shorter than its sibling, the shagbark. The king nut is also stouter, with much heavier branches. The leaves are bigger and give a much better shade. And the tree wears a winter dress of the dry connecting points where the leaves would connect onto last year's growth. The king nut can also hybridize with the pecan to make much bigger nut meats. Once upon a time in the not-so-distant past, the food of the walnut family, including the hickories, fed North America. Thriving on this bounty was the American mound builder culture and the great savanna food forest builders of here in Ontario. Rolling plains of meadows interspersed with food-bearing trees. This culture's creative and scientific abilities far surpassed the efforts of any European culture of that time. And it successfully fed its people on forest food. The nut trees soaked up the sun, just like grass-fed beef, and spilled the 3 essential fatty acids into food that was twinned with health in body and mind. The king nut was central to its food chain, the American giant of food production. People called it the anti-famine tree, because where these trees matured and grew, famine did not exist. It is a medicine tree of great importance. The pharmacopoeia of the Cherokee people alone employed the medicine of this tree for pain relief, viral remedies, and the extraordinary ability of a bark infusion to improve the suppleness of long bones and prevent injury in various sports. And by the wilderness gardening of these nut trees of the savanna, they were able to harvest nuts to deliver the high-quality, first-class protein into their diet, doubling the protein from the venison. Today, king nut could be reintroduced as an aid to agriculture in North America. If it is planted in hedgerows, the trees would shade the fields from excessive ultraviolet exposure from the sun. The tree's roots would recycle the subsoil mineral, wealth, back into the surface layer of the soil. King nuts make the ecology of the soil habitat around them more stable for insect life. Pollinators can tap abundant supplies of food and resins for protection. Some of the insects and a few birds that use the resins as antibiotic and antifungal wallpaper to protect their offspring as they develop. They form a housekeeping that keeps diseases at bay. Birds multiply in the tree's presence, ingesting the vitamin D vital for egg production while preening in the canopy. The king nut's large leaves sweep the air of particulate pollution, including isotopic radioactive reductions, and their shade protects amphibians from genetic damage. These trees, so carelessly removed from the North American landscape, are capable of doubling the plant-based protein of any farming operation. Making nut milks, nut creams, nut cheeses, and nut tofu can be a new industry for the farming community. In addition, recent research from the District of Southern India has shown that old-style growing of woody perennials like the king nut alongside agricultural crops can increase carbon dioxide sequestration from the atmosphere by 34%. What benefits nature benefits farms. What benefits farms benefits humanity. The king nut is a gift. We have only to accept it. This here is an old-growth tulip tree, one of the tallest members of the Carolinian forest. It can provide medicine for humans as well as habitat for birds of prey. And if you have bees, the amount of nectar these flowers produce is amazing. And this is a wild pawpaw tree. This tree is one of the trees that you can grow as an understory tree underneath your super canopy trees like tulip trees and your nut trees like shagbark hickory. So we create a multi-storied ecosystem that's producing food for humans as well as habitat for non-human beings. And it's something we can give to future generations. That's going to be the focus of my next book, allowing people and communities to create resilient food production systems that align seamlessly with the abundance of nature. I've been working on applying these concepts in my local community, and I can't share too many details on a project I'm working on yet, but these images give you a hint. And who knows, maybe an idea for a future solutions watch. You can use the discount code Embody the Solution for discounts on my book. All annual paid subscriptions to my Substack also get a free digital copy. If you check out my Substack, you're going to find in-depth articles on each of the species that I just talked about in the forest. And also, check out the Mounsey Minute, which airs the second Wednesday of each month on Media Monarchy with me and James Pilato. Here's to making 2025 a year of increased health and food sovereignty through teaming up with regenerative agriculture in the garden.